Hi everyone. You're very welcome to today's discussion with Professor Sunstein at Trinity College, Dublin. My name is Donna Lyons. I'm with the School of Law at Trinity College. Professor Sunstein is Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard. He's a former administrator in the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Obama administration. He's currently chair of the World Health Organization Technical Advisory Group on Behavioral Insights and Sciences for Health. He's a prolific writer and winner of the Hallberg Prize. He is author of How Change Happens and co-author of Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth and Happiness, and most too much information, which you should be able to see here. It's probably a little bit hard to see. It's a very good book. So too much information, understanding what you don't want to know. And I'm delighted to be launching that with you here today at Trinity and in Ireland. I found it very interesting, and I know it's received many positive reviews so far. I also know you were in Trinity, if I'm correct, back in November 2017. And so I've come down to campus in your honor, because I know you'd really like to be here today. There's restricted access to campus, but I have come down despite the restrictions, and hopefully it feels a bit more real. You are hugely popular amongst academic students and alumni of the college and far beyond the university throughout Ireland. So just to explain the format, Professor Sunstein will do a 10-minute presentation of the book. I'll then ask a couple of questions, and after that I'll bring in questions from the attendees. And just to say again, we do have to finish up at 4 o'clock on the dot because Cass has other meetings to go to. But I'm really looking forward to this discussion, and we're very privileged to have you. So over to you, Cass.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be doing this at Trinity, which is probably the most beautiful campus on the planet and a place that I cherish and treasure. Also, I have some breaking news, which is because it's lockdown and there are only so many hours you can devote to writing about law and policy. I did a genetic test for the first time, and one piece of the test is strongly indicative of some Irish ancestry.
Great.
It's not completely determinative, but that's a reasonable reading, and that's my preferred reading. So I'm happy to be back with my people, as well as my marriage, where it's 100%.
Of course.
Okay, so let me tell you two stories which kind of motivated this book. They're actually true stories, and they preceded the enterprise. When I was in the White House, we were focused on information disclosure as a policy tool and as an instrument of law, and growing out of the common law, and it might involve the environment, it might involve safety and health. And we had a big debate about whether to apply our calorie label requirement to movie theaters. And people had different views about how to think about the law and how to think about the policy. And after we went out for public comment, where we didn't propose to include movie theaters, the data that we learned about the health impacts was strongly suggestive that calorie labels should be applied to what you buy at a movie theater. And so we applied the regulation to that. And I was very pleased. That was my view all along. And I sent a note to a good friend celebrating the outcome. And her response was 3 words: Cass ruined popcorn. Now that was deflating, but I also thought profound. That when people go to the movie theater to see Star Wars or Tenet, which I highly recommend, or a French independent movie or whatever, they don't want to, as they sit in their seat with their food, think, how fat exactly am I getting right now? And there's a lesson there about the emotional impact of providing people with information. And our data is actually coming in suggesting that there are a lot of people who, in response to calorie labels, don't eat less, but do smile less. So fewer smiles, same weight, which suggests that for that segment of the population, the calorie label mandate is a loser, and possibly a big loser. The second story is more personal, if you'll indulge me. And this involves my father, who a number of years ago, decades ago, was a healthy, tennis playing, active, 60-something-year-old who started stumbling on the tennis court. And that was very uncharacteristic. And my mother and I took him in for a battery of tests. After about 5 hours of testing, starting 8 in the morning, she came back after lunch and said, I've got great news. They have the results of the test, and you're going to be, she said, told her husband, you're going to be completely fine. There's nothing wrong with you. They're going to keep you in for a day just for checking, but clean bill of health, you're fine. And then my mother, after we had a happy lunch, the three of us, we were ready to take me back to school. I was in college. She took me to the parking lot, and this is a long time ago, but I remember it as if it was 1 minute ago. Her face completely transformed. It was like she was an actor who could change emotions like that. And her face became grief-stricken. And she said, this is not what I said. He has a brain tumor, a really bad one. And there's no hope at all. He's going to die within a year. He'll be okay for a while, but he's going to die within a year. You're losing your father. And she said, and I'm not going to tell him, and neither are you. Okay, and we didn't. And I think I know the call she made, which is she thought he's going to have a number of months of decent life, and I don't want to steal that from him. And I think she was also thinking, I'm going to have a number of months which are going to be hard along one dimension, but at least they can be normal among a number of other dimensions. And I want to give myself and him everything I can. And it's not clear that's the right call for every family. The book is agnostic on whether it's the right call for our family. I think knowing my parents, my mother knew what she was doing and did do the right thing. Okay, when I was in the White House, we did a lot about information disclosure. We also did a lot about information acquisition. There are 11 billion hours in paperwork requirements imposed on the American people. A lot of that is sludge, that is frictions that make life worse. And what we didn't analyze as well as I think one should, and this is true of every country, what are the human consequences of information disclosure? I have a lot of data now about what people want to know. People don't want to know when they're going to die. Overwhelming majority doesn't want to know that. I have that actually now from 11 countries, and that cuts across national divisions. A lot of people don't want to know if they're predisposed toward cancer. Somewhere between 40 and 50% don't want to know. People don't want to know if they're going to get Alzheimer's. Only 43% of one large country, I won't mention it right now, want calorie labels. The majority, they don't want that. They don't want their popcorn to be ruined. 58% of people want to know if the person on whom they has a crush on them. That's interesting. I would expect a higher number. Maybe a number of those people who don't want, the 42%, are thinking, it's not going to be reciprocated. I don't want that popcorn to be ruined. Or maybe some of them are thinking it's going to be reciprocated and that's dangerous. I'm involved with someone else. Don't tell me. So I have a lot of data about what people want to know and what people don't want to know. And people are often willing to pay for information when they want it. And they're often willing to pay not to get information when they don't want it. They'll say, I'll pay you money not to tell me. Okay, here's what I think emerges from exploring the data and thinking about the nature of the human animal. That people want information if they think it's useful, and if they think it's either affirmatively harmful to their life, or if it's neutral, neither good nor bad, they don't want it. And that explains a lot of the data. That bears on mandatory labeling, on what the legal system should do in domains that range from fuel economy to nutrition, to sunscreen, to genetically engineered food. Also, people care a lot about whether information makes them happy or sad, or feel safe or scared. And this is highly relevant to the pandemic we're in the midst of, What's picked up in the material, which no government in the world so far as I'm aware of has paid explicit attention to, is whether people are going to be having tougher days once they learn something. If they are, they're going to avoid the information, they won't pay attention to it, and if they get it and do pay attention to it, still there's a loss, which is that popcorn is ruined. Mm-hmm. The plea in the book is not for less information and less disclosure. Frequently that's essential. The book's title was for a long time, Knowledge is Power, but Ignorance is Bliss, which was pointing at the two sides. But it is a plea for paying more, what's the right word, empathetic attention than governments and doctors typically do, which is whether the information that people are getting is having a positive or negative impact on their ability to enjoy their days. The most precious thing that people have, that human beings are blessed to have, is time. To find ways to give people more of it is good guidance for information policy.
Thank you for that, Professor Sunstein. I think that's the last sentence of the last chapter of your book. I found it very, very moving. And speaking of the last chapter, so the initial chapters in your book are to do with information that people receive and which information individuals want to know and what they don't want to know. And then later in the book, you shift gear and you talk about too much information from another angle. So exploring the idea of sludge, which you just mentioned, administrative burdens imposed by governments, generally asking people to provide information. So just a disclaimer, this isn't my area of research or expertise, but it's something I have deeply considered for a long time because it so pervasively affects our daily lives. So I'd like to ask you one or two questions about that. And then I know a lot of the attendees have questions about the earlier chapters in the book. So I'll leave that to them. So if, with your permission, I would just read a short quote about sludge from the book. Would that be okay?
Great.
Okay. So page 158, to understand what sludge matters, let's begin with the assumption that people are fully rational and that in deciding whether to overcome administrative burdens, they make some calculation about costs and benefits. Even if the benefits are high, the relevant costs might prove overwhelming. These costs can take qualitatively different forms. They might involve acquisition of information, which might be difficult and costly. They might involve time, which people might not have. They might be psychological in the sense that they involve frustration, stigma, and humiliation. For any of those reasons, it might be very difficult to navigate or overcome the sludge. In some cases, doing the relevant paperwork might be literally impossible. It simply may not be feasible for people to fill out the forms. By themselves, these points help to explain low take-up rates for many federal and state programs, as well as the immense difficulty that people have in obtaining permits or licenses of various sorts. We can even see sludge as an obstacle to freedom, especially insofar as it reduces or impairs navigability. And then a couple of pages later, you say that our cognitive resources are limited. Inevitably, we're able to focus on only a small subset of life's challenges. Each of us has limited mental bandwidth. For those who are busy, poor, disabled, or elderly, the problem of cognitive scarcity is especially serious. If you are busy or poor, you're focused on an assortment of life's challenges. The same is true if you're disabled. If you suffer from a mental disability or if you are elderly, your cognitive limits may be severe. For that reason, it is important to focus on the distributional effects of administrative burdens, on whom they are most likely to hurt. As a practical matter, the answer is often the poorest among us. A central reason is that if you're poor, you have to focus on a wide range of immediately pressing problems. If the government is asking poor people to navigate a complex system or to fill out a lot of forms, they might give up. But the problem is hardly limited to the poor. When programs are designed to benefit the elderly, sludge might be especially damaging, at least if the population suffers from reduced cognitive capacity. And I thought that was very powerful. And I was just wondering, taking the example of people in the lower socioeconomic income bracket who might be seeking state support, And it's one thing to discuss this academically, but when you see that the hoops and the routine humiliation that vulnerable people have to go through in order to access support in Ireland anyway, it can be heartbreaking to watch. And I think a person on the receiving end could be forgiven for thinking that the system is intentionally designed to obstruct them and to cause them that added pain. Now, you mentioned in the book that it may be that there could be some intention on the part of the architects of these bureaucratic systems, and sometimes it's accidental. I'm just wondering, no matter whether it's by design or by accident, if the administrative hurdles are so difficult for ordinary people to overcome, is it possible that people end up believing that the system is designed to make their lives more difficult? And if so, is there a connection between government bureaucracy and trust or faith in government? Is that it? Can you hear me okay?
We have a little, can you hear me?
Yes.
Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we had a little instability in the connection, which maybe was a plot by someone who wants more sludge in the world. Okay, so I think you're completely right that, okay, so we can think of three categories of cases. Cases where, let's say, the humiliation or stigma or injury to dignity that people feel because there's sludge. You know, you have to fill out forms and you have to hang on the line, or you have to go someplace, or you have to wait some period where that's intended. It might be an instrument of rationing something where you're trying to give less of it out, and people are aware that the recipients are going to feel, you know, terrible, and they're counting on that to ration it. That's the least pleasant of the sources of the emotional burden of sludge. The second category is, let's say it's the most benign, where I think you're quite right, where some lawyer, and I saw this in real time in government, some lawyer says we have to make sure they're eligible, and the only way to make sure they're eligible is to impose a lot of sludge. And we're going to do it without a big smile on our face, but because of the legal requirements. And there's no desire to humiliate people. It's just desire to make sure they deserve it. So if you're going to be getting some benefits, let's say from Trinity, or some benefits from the University of California, or a visa to go to Ireland, or a visa to visit South Africa, it may be humiliating and terrible under certain circumstances, maybe COVID, to go through it, but there's no intention to do that. Still, the people will feel, not unreasonably, that there was some malevolent actor behind the sludge. And then there's a third category, which is, I think, the most interesting. And I also saw this in real time. I've seen it both in Brussels and in the United States. So I've worked a bit with Brussels on this. There's a lot of sludge in Brussels. Mm-hmm. and the reason for the sludge isn't they want to make people feel humiliated or less respected. It's that they're just not thinking hard enough about the impact on people. So it's not completely benign. It's a failure of imagination or empathy. And this happens. And that's why for all institutions, I'm trying to get Harvard Law School now to do this with respect to sludge, to have a catalog of what kind of imposition they're imposing on people. They may be students who, in circumstances of the pandemic, are struggling with a lot. They may be students who have a disability. They may be students who have an ill family member. And then the sludge can be not only, a real intrusion on people, but perceived as an intentional intrusion on people. So you often infer from the impact of something a desire to impose that impact. And in the cases we're now discussing, there wasn't an intention, but it wasn't completely benign. It was an absence of sufficient foresight. That's a long way of saying yes.
It's interesting. It's very interesting, though, isn't it? And I think the attendees will have more questions on that. So moving on, maybe just a slightly different angle on that. And as I say, I'm not a specialist, so you can tell me if I'm totally off track. But I was talking to someone recently about this concept of technological determinism, which is that the structure of technology these days determines how people in society interact with technology rather than people and society determining how they themselves choose to interact with technology. So that it could be said that actually, even though humans have designed the architecture of technology, it determines our behavior rather than the other way around. And I'm just wondering, would something like that apply to the architecture of bureaucracy that's developed in the modern world, that it could be said to govern us rather than vice versa? Is it unstoppable? And is that maybe why there's so much denial around the fact that sludge is a problem? It is difficult, I think, to get people to acknowledge that it's a problem. And maybe that's because once we name it as a problem, we have to talk about solutions. So there's a lot in that, but I was just wondering if you had any thoughts at all.
Okay, that's great. So let's talk about technology and sludge. So think of sludge as any kind of friction that separates you from where you want to go. So it might be to get economic benefits that are available under circumstances of the pandemic. You have to navigate stuff, or it may be to get healthcare. You have to do things that are time consuming or confusing, or to get educational opportunity. You have to do a bunch of things, one of which is to get through sludge. Okay, so with technology, the world of sludge is very different. Human beings make a lot of choices with respect to technology. So Facebook can make voting, let's say, easier for you in the sense that it can give you a sense of how you can vote, where you can vote, when you can vote, which reduces voting sludge, let's say, in an unprecedented way. If you want access to something, let's say you want to learn about something, an online provider can take the sludge away. So you can get a course, you can learn, I hope, I aspire, you can learn Irish, with less sludge than you've ever encountered, maybe. So technology has behind it a series of human choices, which can be sludge reducers or sludge increasers. So there's increasing attention to dark patterns online, which often, I'll give you a couple examples of dark patterns. If you subscribe to something, there's no sludge. You can do it, subscribe to something that'll send you every month something that you're kind of interested in. But to stop the subscription is really sludgeful. And the technology is behind both the sludge reduction and the sludge magnification. It might be that to find out terms of an agreement that you've entered into with some provider of something, you have to get through a lot of sludge. And that some human beings behind that. Or it might be someone else will make it, crystal clear. There's no sludge to know what your privacy, your economic losses are. So I'd say with respect to technological determinism, it's clearly the case that the option set shifts a lot, but until technology develops its own will, that might be coming, but not today, not tomorrow, I hope. The Zoom has its own will sometimes. Yeah. The human beings behind it, they're in the three categories we discussed of intentional sludge imposition for, let's say, self-interested or other reasons, inadvertent impositions through sludge, and just a failure to attend to what sludge is actually going to mean on the ground for people.
These ideas, I think they're so important, and I think that's why it's really important to promote this book as much as possible. So again, thanks for participating in this. I'm actually going to bring in Peter Stone on this, so let me just promote you to a panelist, Peter. So there you are. Just one second there. So Peter is an associate professor of political science here in Trinity, and he was an assistant professor of political science at Stanford before that. He specializes in political theory, especially areas of democratic theory, theories of justice, rational choice theory, and the philosophy of social science. So I'll hand it over to you there, Peter.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Delighted to talk about this. I had a very clear topic I wanted to ask you about. It's one of my favorite pet peeves. I mentioned it to Donna. It's on the subject of technology, and that's, you know, we have this wonderful thing over here called Gdpr. You know, the General Data Protection Regulation. If anything could turn me into a Eurosceptic, it's that. But in particular, what it does with websites there, you know, I mean, and it's done in a very benevolent way, of course, because it's all about empowering me and control over my data. But what it means is if I want to read like an article that will take me 5 minutes on some news site, they'll give me the little thing that pops up and says, hey, you want to know about our privacy policy and all of that? You want to spend 15 minutes navigating this and seeing whether you want to, or do you just want to click yes without ever reading that kind of thing? So that's a really classic case, I think, of like of information with benevolent intentions, I think maybe not working out the way is. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about like navigating the control of our data and, you know, how might we do it smarter than we do it?
Great. So I tend to agree with you, and I say tend to because I haven't studied it in detail, in thinking that the idea that you go on a website, which you clearly want to go to, they have a privacy policy, which is probably standard, and you either have to study something that's incomprehensible or just wastefully click without doing that. That's not a good idea. So offhand, there are two sets of tools. There are choice-preserving tools, which involve consent and restriction, and there are prohibitions on certain usages. And what I want to do if I were a regulator again is to have a process of looking at what are the concrete risks to users. And if the risk is, for example, people's information will be turned into something that could be used against them. Let's say it's about political or health-related information that could be provided to people who could use it to cause harm to them, then we might want to have a flat ban. We'd want to know the magnitude of the harm and if there's any benefit to users from the usages. But to think that there's a class of things where information sharing just should be flatly prohibited, and the consent requirement is not a good avenue for it because people won't understand it and they're giving up something that reasonable people wouldn't give up if informed. Then there are other things which are consensual usages, which are for a certain percentage of the population, really something which on reflection they wouldn't want. And not the majority, not everyone. And there to have something very clear, which would say, would you enable us to do X or not? Where it's really simple. And if they're malevolent usages, and we're stipulating they're malevolent in the sense that a significant chunk of people wouldn't want it, then to give them a simple yes or no would be a really good idea. And this isn't intended as a policy proposal, it's just two options to organize what in government is called a policy process. I completely agree with you that useless sludge is not likely to be the ideal path to optimal privacy protection.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. We have Cormac Bergen here as well, who's a law and political science graduate from Trinity and currently studying public international law at Lyons. Would you like to go ahead there, Cormac?
Hi, Professor. Sometimes really fascinating to hear your opinions on all these matters. I just wanted interested in your point about voting and the sludge that Facebook can possibly remove. Do you think with the current volume of information available to voters and the fact that it's difficult to distinguish between fake news and possibly more real news, that it's voters have become less rational and more reckless about their votes because they find it difficult to navigate the way through the information?
I'll tell you my association as you talk. My co-author and kind of one of my heroes, Daniel Kahneman, did an interview recently where he was asked a lot of really good questions and he kept saying, I don't know. And the interviewer was not thrilled with those answers and finally said, what do you think? And he said, it's not a matter of thinking, it's an empirical question, and I don't have the data. And I actually made a bumper, isn't this pathetic? I made a bumper sticker out of that for my car. It says it's an empirical question and I don't have the data. I didn't put it on my car because I thought the police would be more likely to stop me if they saw that. But I did put it on an office door, which is still there when there used to be offices. Okay, okay. Let me talk a little bit about your question. Whether voters are more or less informed, it's an empirical question, and it's knowable-ish, I want to say. That is based on what evidence we have. We could probably learn something. Whether their voters are more knowledgeable in, let's say, September 2020 than they are in September 2021, that's something on which we really could do an empirical study. It would be very worthwhile. What is clear is that misinformation and its potential to move quickly across large populations is causing some kind of spike in, let's say, not knowledge, though whether it's causing an all things considered increase compared to previously, there's so many confounds, like there's a lot more truthful information I wouldn't want to say. But let me give you a little data supporting the music of your question. And it's, I think, both intuitive and startling. Okay, suppose I said just now two things. Something about, let's say, climate change or the pandemic that is not true, and then followed it in 3 seconds with the following statement. What I just said is false. Okay, for a substantial number of human beings who hear something like that, it will echo in their mind that the statement they heard is true, even if they were simultaneously told it's false. It's called truth bias, and it means we tend to remember things that are false as true, even if we're informed in real time that it's false. Okay, that's an extremely serious problem. It helps explain why if a politician says something that's false, it's often extremely impactful, even if people know it's not true. So I'll give you one example from the country once known as the United States, and I hope still known as the United States. I say that because we have some very sharp divisions. If you say that Hillary Clinton's emails, what a horrible crime, even if that is said in the context of a report on why it's not a horrible crime, people remember, I guess maybe it's a horrible crime. And that suggests misinformation has more power because of how the human mind works than we might otherwise think.
Thank you so much, Lucas. Thanks, Cormac. And I have Colette, who is an undergraduate student in political science, also in Trinity College, Dublin. Would you like to take it away, Colette? Just if you just unmute yourself there, actually. Maybe I'll just move on to the next questioner and come back, Colette, unless you can hear me. Let's see if we can get Ronan up. So Ronan.
What's cool about, should we say something behavioral about muting and unmuting? So in behavioral science, it's common to think about system 1, which is the automatic system, and system 2, which is the more deliberative system. So what we've just discussed suggests the power of system 1. System 2 might know it's false, I was just told, but system 1 thinks I just heard that. So maybe, and unmuting is something that system 1 doesn't get, and system 2 has to work hard. So unmuting is a little bit of sludge.
Right, interesting. Well, luckily we have Ronan McGurn on the line, who is also a law and political science graduate from Trinity College, Dublin, and he has a question for you. Would you like to go ahead, Ronan?
Thanks, Donna. Hi, Cass. It's good to see you again. I remember when you came to Trinity, and it was very nice to hear you talk then. Very interesting evening. And I would like to just follow up with what Cormac was saying there. I'd like to kind of take the information provider's stance in a way. So I agree with you that the pursuit of just information that is true is the current kind of campaign, it's the current zeitgeist. Information providers, whether it's governments or social media platforms, are already struggling quite enough as it is to provide information that is simply true. So how, practically speaking, would we go about a system of an additional welfare-based provision of information? In other words, not information that's merely true, but also tailored to the welfare of the individual recipient. How would you go about making something like that feasible on a large scale?
Okay, great. So let's give some polar cases, shall we? So for graphic warnings for cigarettes, I'm going to stipulate some things, but just to answer your question, work with me here. Let's assume that in France, there's data suggesting that graphic warnings for cigarettes will prevent a significant number of deaths by deterring incidents of smoking and also by increasing smoking cessation. Then we know that we have large health benefits. And let's just agree that for people who can't quit, the graphic health warnings are dismaying, so they create a welfare loss. But the welfare loss for smokers on a certain understanding of the data, which I'm just making up, would have to be catastrophically high to outweigh the welfare savings from the mortalities averted. So let's assume that there's a universe of disclosure requirements that fall within that category, where the health and other benefits are really high, and the, let's say, emotional costs cannot conceivably have the magnitude that would justify not going forward. So what I've just described is actually standard practice in some countries, where you try to specify the endpoints based on whatever data you have. And it might be that you have a randomized controlled trial. It might be you don't, but you have a before and after picture of what graphic warnings do. And then you're completely in business. And if you're lucky, you have a lot of numbers. Okay, let's contrast that, shall we, with required disclosure of the use of genetically modified organisms in food, where the view of relevant authorities, again, work with me here, whether or not you agree with the premise, is that there's no health benefit, that genetically modified organisms don't, in your celery or your apple, don't create any health risk, that there's no ecological harm either. That's less clearly the consensus, but it's pretty clearly the consensus. Let's just stipulate that. Then the benefits from disclosure are zero. It's not going to help the environment or health. It's going to cost something to require the disclosure. And it's also going to mislead people, because we have data suggesting if people see a label, they tend to think that it's accompanied by another word, danger. So you create only losses and no gains on the stipulated facts about that. And then we have two categories of mandate the disclosure, don't. And then there are going to be some that are hard, where, you know, what kind of labels you put on sunscreen to tell people that at certain low levels of protection, the cancer reduction is basically zero. This will not protect you from skin cancer. Is that helpful on balance? I'm kind of positively inclined to that, but data, please. And okay, so I'll talk a little bit more. So when I was in the US government, I was co-chair of the, what was called in a kind of self-congratulatory way, the high-level regulatory cooperation council between the European Union and the United States. And we had 2 meetings a year. And I felt at that time that the EU was not focused on the question we're discussing, of what are the actual impacts of disclosure requirements by reference to the best data we could assemble. It was more focused on getting, and this is a generalization, but agreement among stakeholders. And it's not the worst thing. But with respect to taking agreement among stakeholders as the basis for mandating or not mandating disclosure, Shakespeare said that, I'm going to paraphrase him, that way lies madness. Don't do that. Think of the consequences.
Thanks, Cass. It's excellent. And thanks, Ronan. Colette is on the line now. Would you like to go ahead?
Yes, I apologize. Zoom decided it didn't like the speaker, so the audio went, and I apologize. I found the book very, very interesting. It's amazing how much information that we get that we're not even aware that we're getting. And although I'm a student, I'm also a mature student and a parent of 3 children. And I've noticed a big increase, particularly in teenagers with anxiety levels. And I personally, my view is that there is so much information being thrown at people that younger people are finding it difficult to cope. There's a lot of judging, you know, if one of them goes to a shop and buys this bar of chocolate, it's like, oh, how many calories are in that? Is there a correlation? Like, all this information is meant to be for our welfare, but is it really actually doing us as much good as they say it is?
We've probably lost the connection there.
Okay, I heard it's a great question. Shall we start with a poem, a little excerpt from a poem, may we? It's Trinity, after all, so we can do some literature. So Thomas Gray's Ode on a Distant Prospect of Eton College, which has a very famous last line, you're going to hear it in a moment. It's actually an unbearably beautiful poem. Here are the last lines. It's an older writer, is the narrator, who is looking at young people, maybe like your kids, who are, in his case, though not in your kid's life, sadly, just enjoying the delight and openness and hope and expectation of youth. And here's what Thomas Gray writes: to each his sufferings, all are men, condemned alike to groan, the tender for another's pain, the unfeeling for his own. Yet, why should they know their fate, since sorrow never comes too late, and happiness too swiftly flies? Thought would destroy their paradise, no more. Where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. It's pretty good, yeah? And it makes the famous last lines, which have a kind of familiarity. It puts them in a setting which makes it, about life and your kids. Okay, here's some data on Facebook, which is social media, and we can take that as this is a metaphor for, Colette, what you're describing. People, and this is people of all ages, who demand, let's say, approximately €100 to get off Facebook for a month, were taken up on their offer. They were told, we'll give you €100, no Facebook this month. And they said, okay. And then they were asked a series of questions in the course of the month about how's life going. And it turned out that people were less anxious compared to the control where they were still on social media. They were less depressed, they were happier, and they were more satisfied with their life. So on every measure of well-being that you could devise, the people who took the €100 and were off Facebook were happier. Then they were asked after the end of the month, how much would you have to be paid to be off Facebook another month? And they said, about €87. Now that's an intriguing answer. It's less than 100, so they learned something about what a good month it was. But they didn't say, you don't have to pay me, I'm getting off. It was a good month. So the data is supportive of your hypothesis, which is that being flooded with information can increase anxiety and distress. We need to know more with respect to life of teenagers in general, whether it's political stuff, whether it's peer comparisons, whether it's just the fact that the head isn't as quiet as is ideal. We do know that people who are prone to anxiety, many of them are, by virtue of that, information seeking. They kind of need to know. And that can fuel anxiety, which can in turn fuel information seeking. And then we can have a not ideal spiral. So to scale it back 10%, where it is social media use, that probably is good for well-being.
Thank you, Cass. Thanks so much, Colette. I have a couple of questions here in the Q&A. Just one comment from Patricia, who says, I don't have a question, but I totally agree with your mom's choice. I personally would not communicate to my family or anyone I know if I should be diagnosed with cancer. I appreciate that you are enlightening us in this way. And from Marky, who is a PhD student with us in Trinity College Dublin. So Marta asks, I would like to ask Professor Sunstein what his advice to professional journalists would be in light of what has just been said. And I think Marta has had a career in journalism prior to taking up the PhD. Now, I'm not sure exactly when that came through. I'm wondering, would you like to link it up with one aspect of your presentation, or should I ask Marta for a clarification on which aspect she was asking about?
I'm happy to respond. It's a great question.
Yeah.
So I think for journalists, I'm cautious about advising journalists who know what they're doing. I'm just a law professor, but for journalists to think hard about the human consequences of what they're doing is a really good idea. And to think that if they're reporting on falsehoods, even to debunk them, there's a question to be asked whether that's going to help or not. It might help, but to do it in a way that doesn't spread the falsehood, and to think about what kind of reporting actually is not going to, just make people scared and sad and not do anything, but is going to improve their lives in some way. And that's a road in, at least. It seems a little bland, but it can work like a knife, I think, if you go through the newspaper today and see what of these stories are improving people's lives in some way, or what would you work on that would do that? I can say for a lawyer in deciding what to write about myself, and I guess I am a little bit of a journalist. I write a column. I should think about that more. I'll try.
Thank you, Cass. We have Aileen Kavanagh here, who is Chair of Constitutional Governance in Trinity and formerly was a professor of law in Oxford. And Aileen, I've promoted you to a panelist. If you want to unmute yourself, you could ask the question there.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Now let's see if I can even make myself visible. Let me see if I can do that.
There you are.
Great. So delighted to have you here, Cass, and we hope to welcome you in person to Trinity, and great to hear about your Irish background. I think in Ireland you'll be Cass O. Sunstein, right? And we'd be delighted to have you, and also, and I wouldn't dream of mentioning this if it weren't for the gender difference, we'd also obviously love to have your wife, Samantha Power, to come along. We need education of idealists here in Ireland and in Trinity. So I have two quick questions. One is maybe a naive sounding question, or an actually naive question about the data. So you use that word a lot about data. And I assume you control for this, but here's the question. So often people just don't know what information they want. They say they want. I want to know why you want to finish this marriage. I want to know everything, people say. But actually they don't know what they're capable of. They don't know what truths they're capable of taking. And that applies to your very moving story about your parents. My experience of a similar situation was the revelation that, first of all, people are very different in how much information they can take at what time, but also how people are just deeply incorrect about their claims to know what they want to know. So I assume your data corrects for this, in other words, the role of self-perception, but I'd be interested to know. The second question goes to your bumper sticker and the great statement from your co-author and friend, Daniel Kahneman, I don't know. So the question that is stimulated by that is for policy development and policy making. What about the role of I don't know? I just don't know what the consequences will be. Not that I don't know, but this is knowledge we will never have. So I'm thinking about policy making proposals where we don't know, and I would feel we will never know what consequences they will have. Should those policies be ruled out? Because we just cannot know the empirical question, the answers to those empirical questions. We have a hunch it might work. We have a well-meaning belief that we should give it a go. Let's give it a go. But we don't know. Would you rule out that kind of approach to policy making? Or would you say there is room for that, even though we don't have answers to the empirical questions related to the consequences?
What great questions. So let me talk around them. I switched, by the way, my background to books because I'm so impressed with your background.
And you know that this is in Trinity? This is an advertisement to lure you to Trinity. This is the long room, of course.
It's extraordinary. So as when I was in government, I was subject to the president, of course. I was overseeing government regulation. And if an agency said, we're going to do a disclosure requirement, and we asked, what effects will it have? And they said, we don't know. That would not be, that would not encourage going forward. So because the universe of things that governments can do is so large, if a policy is promoted without information about whether it's going to help, to say we have a hunch, it wouldn't be that that would always be a bad idea. And I'll talk about circumstances where it might not be a bad idea, but in Ireland or in Germany, I doubt that the Chancellor Merkel would be in favor of a policy where her people said, we don't know if it's going to do any good. If they said, if we have a hunch, she might say, life is really short. Have more than a hunch. On the other hand, if the cost of a policy is extremely low, and if you don't know how much good it's going to do, but you have a lower bound, which is in excess of the cost, then go for it. And I'll give you an example. We had a rule, not a disclosure rule, involving prison rape, where we didn't know how much the law was going to do. It had about 12 things in it to reduce the incidence of prison rape. We know the cost of the rule in terms of training and personnel. If that rule was extremely ineffective, if it did very little to reduce the incidence of prison rape, it was still a good idea. Unless you thought a prison rape was basically fine, if you gave it a very low economic cost and you multiplied it times a very ineffective policy, still it would be worth it. And there are other disclosure policies that have that form. It doesn't cost much. If it doesn't do very well, it's still going to exceed that. Mm-hmm. Okay, in terms of my surveys, you're raising a great point, and there's a semantic issue that I think is clarifying. I'll get to that in a moment. Often people don't want information, especially bad information, and they underestimate their own resilience. So the data suggests that people are often clear in their own minds that if they get negative health information, it's going to be devastating. And either it's just not devastating, or it turns out within a relatively short period to be fine. So if people learn, they have diabetes, or, they have an anxiety disorder, that's really not good news. But people come to terms with it really fast, and and they way overestimate the negative effect. So that's important. Our data does not correct for that because it's interested not in the effects on well-being, which is very fundamental, but in what people want ex ante to know. So if they underestimate or overestimate the impact of the information, that is itself good to know because it will affect their desire to get it and their willingness to receive it. It doesn't tell us everything. And one of the themes of the book is that the criterion that economists emphasize, which is willingness to pay, runs into exactly the problem you describe, where people might be willing to pay for information that is not worth very much, or they're willing to pay very little for information that's worth a ton, or they're willing to pay not to receive information, and you see where I'm going. That there's a mismatch between the experience of receiving information and the anticipated experience. And what matters for policy most is the actual effect on experience.
Thank you, Cass. Thank you so much, Aileen. I think there was a bit of a hiccup on Zoom there. In any case, we're close to the time, so I think I'll just read out the other questions, but not ask you to answer them. Just to give you an idea of what people are thinking, and maybe you'll come back another day and we can discuss these issues again. So from Audrey, thank you very much for your presentation. This is definitely a fascinating topic. I would like to ask your opinion on the following. You mentioned that people would in general rather not know information which make them unhappy and has a negative connotation. Yet we can note the success of fear-mongering politicians or even the rising popularity of conspiracy theories, which can probably be considered to be negative in and of themselves. Is this a paradoxical reaction of individuals to the sludge and to the constant and excessive information that they are bombarded with, which would lead them to accept a certain kind of negative information more easily? Apologies for the length of the question, and thank you again for your presentation. And from Declan Ledden, I would like to ask Cass, how do we address people's obsession with the deep state? And could this be addressed with more transparency and less emphasis on the so-called Leviathan bureaucracy with clarity around behaviours? From an anonymous attendee, have your views on the precautionary principle changed at all in light of the way governments around the world have had to take unprecedented action to protect populations during the coronavirus pandemic? And from Saif McGrath, who's a PhD student with us, on financial regulation, I was wondering what Professor Sunstein's thoughts are on the use of comparison tools in relation to information disclosure for complex products like insurance and mortgages. Do they just add up, or do they just add to the sludge, or would they help? So those are food for thought. We totally understand how busy your schedule is, but just wanted to show how interested the attendees are and how fascinating your presentation has been.
Time for lightning round, quick answers?
Of course, it's completely up to you. We have time if you have time.
A pleasure. So comparison tools, I like them. There's data suggesting that they're really helpful. So that's great. On the precautionary principle, my worry is that if you take precautions against something, you may simultaneously offend the precautionary principle by giving rise to risks against which you want to take precautions. So you take precautions because of the precautionary principle. The precautions you take offend the precautionary principle, and now your head's spinning around really fast, which itself violates the precautionary principle. So I'm in favor of precautionary activity. And for the pandemic, we need a lot of that. It is justified typically, not all of it, of course, but where it's justified because it has health benefits that outweigh the associated costs. And that's not the whole framework, but that's a good framework. So a lot of precautions are justified by doing an inquiry into what is the aggregate impact. And we want to consider distributional impacts for the most vulnerable, what's happening to the most vulnerable people. In terms of the question about the deep state, what a great question. It's a terrific word because it suggests there's some kind of conspiracy out there. I think to have transparency that there are real people who are working every day in countries all over the world to keep people safe, and they're mortal and they're just like us, except a lot of them are paid less and work for longer hours. Don't be scared of them, but make sure they do their jobs. In terms of negative information and avoiding bad news, people don't want to hear, you know, that they're having a bad hair day. To tell someone you're looking tired might be helpful a little bit, but that's not the nicest thing to say. To tell people, for doctors say, I've got really bad news for you, you have X, that might be essential, but people don't want that. On the other hand, if a politician says those other people are going to do something terrible to you, vote for me, or there's a conspiracy in the world to create this awfulness, both of those can be quite effective because they don't trigger an immediate sense of personal health or safety threat. They do they trigger more tribal things, sense of tribal identity, and that can be an effective thing for a politician.
Thank you, Cass. Fantastic responses, and we're just very grateful to you for contributing your time and bringing your expertise to this. Is there anything you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Just heartfelt gratitude to an incredible institution I've been privileged to visit, and I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Samuel Beckett, and to the world, Trinity is a beacon of light of like 1,000 different kinds. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Professor Sunstein. You're a phenomenal thinker and a highly influential figure, and this book touches on very important issues relating to the modern world. I found it very interesting. I would recommend it. So with that, I would thank you again. Thanks to all the attendees, and I'll close the session.